So I got a new bit and I used it to make this stool, and I want to show you how I did it. Some of you might wonder what you do with a new tool you've never used before. Well, in my case, what I'm going to do is I found this little fella here, and I'm going to use it to actually cut the first stool top that we're going to see. I'm going to cut a test part. I'm going to go through my tool database and find a tool that looks remotely like this. Find that, check the feeds and speeds, make sure everything looks relatively close, and I want to cut a test part. Now a test part I hate to waste, so I'm going to create a little tiny small olive dish, possibly, using the same sort of process to build the first bar stool that we're going to see. So let's go ahead into the software and I'll set that up and we'll cut that part right away.
Let's go ahead and now start a job. It's going to be a single-sided job. The width is going to be 9, the height will be 5, and the thickness, I'll measure that off my board, and it's 0.88 of an inch. Now let's go ahead and create our first oval. This will be the center of our dish. It's 7 1/4 by a 3 1/4. We'll create that, and then we're going to take that vector and offset it out 1/2 inch, and that'll give us a nice border to work with. Now we're going to draw a single vector along the center of that initial oval that we made. And then we're going to select that, and holding down our Alt key, we'll drag it down to the bottom and snap it to the bottom of that oval. Now we're going to go ahead and use our array copy tool. We're going to make 15 of these in one column, and we're going to make it a 1/4 of an inch gap. And that's going to be our virtual step over for our tool. So we'll copy that, and off we go. Now what we're going to do is we're going to use our interactive trim tool. Make sure that we don't have the rejoin trimmed sections turned on, and we'll just trim those all off. Now if you hold down your left mouse button while you drag, you can trim a whole bunch in a row, and that kind of is a nice little fun way of doing it. If not, you can zoom in and trim them off one at a time if you'd like. So once we get that all done, we're going to go ahead and select those vectors from the bottom up, and then we're going to create our fluting toolpath. Now the order that we select these is important because we're going to use that later in our toolpath settings. Now we're going to go ahead and set a start depth of 0, and the deepest part of our seat is going to be 0.35 an inch in the end, so we're going to use that in our test. We're going to ramp at the start and end, 100% of the distance, and we're going to use a nice smooth ramp. I suggest you play around with this if you want to. And there we go. We're going to use the selection order that I selected those in, and we can calculate that. Now there we have it, and you'll see that in the wireframe you can see the 3 steps that our tool is going to make. So our step down is set to be around 1/3 of the depth that we want. And then we can preview that. Now one thing I want you to notice here is that when it's done the first line, it hops all the way back to the right and does the next line 3 times, and then jumps back again to the right again. Now in the end, it won't be much of a time waster for this little job, but if it was a much bigger job, it might be. So let me show you how we can go and make that just a little bit faster. Now overall, I'm really happy with the step over that we have, so that 1/4 inch looks really good. And I think overall in the bigger seat, it's not going to matter too much. So let's go ahead now and unselect all those vectors, and we're going to right click on every second one in node mode, and we're going to choose reverse direction. And so that way when the tool does one line, instead of picking up and going all the way to the right and plunging again, it's going to go left and right all the way up to the top, saving us a little bit of time in the end. Let's take a look at our tool, and if we want to change the amount of passes that we want to go down, or how much material we want to remove in each pass, that's where we're going to change that right there. I'm going to leave it where it is. I just thought I'd point that out to you. Let's reset that preview and look at that again. And there's, you can see those little red lines. That's where it's actually going to move up to the next line. And see how this looks? It looks much smoother. Thanks to our 3D preview, we can see that ahead of time. And again, it's not going to save a whole lot of time in this little job. I think in the end when I did the timing it was 7 seconds, but if it was a bigger job it might work out to be minutes, so that might be important to you. So just a little tip there for you. That looks really good. So now all we need to do is just create a cutout pass. So again, the settings that we've chosen here are the ones that we're going to use when we cut our first seat using the fluting toolpath. Now, any changes we want to make after we cut this initial little bowl, we're going to transfer those into our thoughts about how we're going to cut that first seat.
sounds pretty good. I was a little concerned that maybe it was burning a little bit, the wood on the bottom, so I sped it up a little bit. You notice we're not using the dust shoe. I decided not to put it on there so I could see the cut, just in case anything went wrong, I could shut the machine off right away. But we're perfectly safe. Okay, so that's all cut. I'm pretty happy with that. I think I'll make a little adjustment to my tooling on the pass depth for the bowl cutter that I have. That's the big round one. And that way I'll make sure that I don't take away as much material. It's a little less aggressive. But I think overall, I'm really quite happy with the way it looks. You can see that when I slowed it down, the burning changed a little bit. So I think I'm on the right track with the feeds. So I'll change that in the software. I think that looks pretty good. So we're gonna go with that, I think. So there we have it. I've taken sanded off the tabs. I like the way it looks. I like the feel of it. So I'm going to take what I learned there and put that into the development of the first bar stool we're going to make. Now I've got a plan here that I've kind of drawn up a little bit. My original plan was to make a much taller kind of breakfast bar stool, but so that it will fit into the size of our desktop software. I'm going to make a much smaller one, maybe a piano-sized stool. That'd be kind of nice. So I'm going to go ahead now, take my plan, go into the software, and get busy.
Before we get into actually creating the seat for the stool using the fluting toolpath and all the stuff that we just learned when we made that sample, I'm going to go through my design concept for this stool. Now, first of all, this stool is going to be more of a rectangle shape. And so this rectangle right here is what I'm going to use to guide this design. And so right now, this seat is, or this vector here is 15 inches by 9.5 inches. So that's going to be the size of the actual top of the seat, or the maximum size I can have. Now I've drawn this seat sort of straight on as if you were sitting on the floor looking at it. And the top of the seat is going to be made up of two parts. The top part, which is going to actually be the fluting toolpath. Now it's not going to look exactly like this because we have some limitations with the fluting toolpath that won't allow us to do this exact design. But this is just me banging around a couple ideas. Then we're going to add a bottom plate to that we can then go ahead and stick in 4 legs. You'll see that I've designed these legs ahead of time and already filled them properly so that they'll fit in nice and tight. So now that we have all that information, I can go ahead now and start thinking about how to create the stool top using the fluting toolpath. So as you can see, I've already set up a brand new sheet called Fluting Seat. And this sheet happens to be just slightly bigger than that rectangle that I pointed out earlier. And that rectangle is the maximum size of the seat, which is 15 by 9.5. Now I took some reference online to make sure that I was relatively close and also looked at the material I had on hand. And that seemed to be a good size for this particular stool. So I was quite happy with that. So what I want to do is I want to create a cutout or a nice shape profile for the top of my seat. So to do that, I'm going to take this original rectangle, right click, and I'm going to go to copy, then right click again, and I'm going to go to paste. So I've got a copy over top of my original vector, and I'm going to go ahead and use my create fillets tool here to create a 2-inch fillet on the corner of that copy of that rectangle. I think that looks like a pretty decent shape for the top of a stool. Now what I also need to do next is to create the vectors so that I can start to develop the lines or the virtual step over that I'm going to use for this tool to create the impression on the top of this seat. So to do that, I've already have 2 ovals already set up. First of all, I have this oval, and the top part of this is going to define the back of my impression, and this little oval here is going to be inside of the impression. Okay, that way I can get a nice shape in the end. And the position of this seriously is just wherever it happened to fall that I thought looked good. So the next thing we're going to do is create a couple vectors. We're going to go ahead and make sure that we have the the fluting layer selected here. I'm going to drop one in here and drop it straight down to the outside edge of that rectangle. Press space on the keyboard so I can draw my next one, and the same over here right to the edge of that. Now I've got those two vectors. You can see that if you go ahead and think in your head that if we create a dome or inverted dome recess around the back of this, we're going to have a decent looking impression for the top of our stool. So the next thing we want to do is to create those virtual step over lines that we can use our fluting toolpath to create. So we're going to go ahead and draw a line from here to there, and then press escape on the keyboard. With that selected, we can go into our array copy tool, and we're going to go ahead and create 10 rows, 1 column, and there's that step over, that virtual step over. So the gap between each line is going to be 1/4 inch. Now you can change that to be closer if you'd like to, or wider if you want to. It just depends on how much sort of cusping you'd like to have between your flutes in your toolpath. And we're going to go ahead and select copy. That looks really great, and we're going to close that down. Now the next thing we need to do is to create the rest of them around here. Now I'm not great at math, and so I need to come up with a bit of a hack to do this with. And it's an oval, it's not a circle. So even if I knew how to do the math on a circle, I don't think it would quite work on an oval. So what I'm going to do is, all I really need to do is figure out what the angle is between these two lines, or close to it anyway. So to do that, I'm going to select that line, and I'm going to go into my rotate selected objects tool. And if I go ahead and move the center point to the end, and I grab this blue handle here and I move it down just so it touches the line below it, you'll see that I get an angle in the rotation form over here of 2.33. I'm going to round that down to be 2, only because I don't mind if it's any tighter. I just don't want it to be any more than what I expect. So let's just close that down and undo that. And we're going to select that again. Notice the point, the center point, or rotation points at the end. And we're going to go ahead and do my circle copy. Now what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that we choose a total number that's going to get us past the center of this, and 50 seems to be a good number to go with. We're going to change this to be 2 degrees, and we're going to go ahead and copy that. And you'll see the rotation center has been adjusted to be where I've put the rotation center, and actually it's not in the right spot. I need to move it over to the center of that circle. And we're going to go ahead and copy that. Then we'll close that down. Well, before we close that down, I want you to note that I haven't gotten to the edge of this circle like I kind of would like to. So I'm going to undo that. And what we're going to do is we're going to stretch this guy out just a little bit. And then we're going to do that again. And you'll see now that's perfect. I've actually got it going outside of that circle, so I can trim off all those extra bits of line that I don't need. So let's close that down. And we're just going to delete out the lines I definitely don't need. I don't need this one. I don't need that one. I don't need that one. I don't need that one. I'll keep that middle one. And then we're going to go ahead and trim these all off like we did in that sample. Just holding down my left mouse button and making sure I've got this unchecked over here. I don't want to have it checked. And just being very careful not to hit that black oval. That's perfect. Now what I want to do is grab all of these vectors and copy them across the center of my job. So I'm going to hold down my left mouse button and go from right to left and select all of those, and then deselect the ones I don't want. To do that, I'm going to hold down my shift key and click the ones I don't want to copy. That looks good. Then I'm going to hold down my control, my shift, and my H key and copy those over the center. And you'll see that I've got a bit of a problem here with these two lines in the center aren't, you know, they're slightly past the center. So I'm not going to worry about it. I'll just go ahead and run the fluting toolpath over both of those. That's not going to hurt anything. And now everything I need right now to go ahead and create my fluting toolpath. Now, like we did in the sample, I could go ahead and reverse the direction of every second one that's here, but that would take a little bit of work. So actually all I really want to do is just select all of those vectors in the order I like them to cut in. And I'm not going to worry about the time saving right now, but if I was going to mass produce these, then I probably would want to worry about that. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, now that I have all those, let's go ahead and bring up my toolpath tab. And we're going to go ahead and quickly go ahead and do our fluting toolpath while we still have those selected. Now you'll see that all those start points are all at one end, but that's okay. Like I said, I'm not going to worry about the time too much with this particular one. So we have our start depth at 0. Our flute depth is going to be at 0.35 like we had in our sample. It's the same bit, but I've gone ahead and adjusted the things that I felt I needed to, like the step down and the actual feeds and speeds, which is great. Again, we're going to ramp at the start and to the end, 100%, use a smooth one. Make sure that we use the vector selection order, and then we're going to go ahead and call this fluting seat, and we'll calculate that. And you'll see again, that looks pretty good, exactly what I have expected, and we'll preview that visible toolpath and see what we end up with. Now I can go ahead if I wanted to and adjust the spacing between the flutes if I want to smooth out that the seat a bit better if I want to, so the cusping that's happening here. But overall, you know, I think I kind of like the way it looks with that kind of scallop shell kind of look. I don't think it's going to take away from it. It's going to give it that rustic feel like I'm looking for. Now once this is all done and I'm happy with it, I'm going to go ahead and create the cutout pass for this, and then we'll move on to actually cutting it on the machine. You'll notice that I've chosen to use 3D tabs for this job, and they're a bit small. Don't panic in the file that you're going to get. These will be larger. In the actual cut file that I cut, they were quite a bit larger than these little ones, so it was super safe.
So we got our material cut down to size. I got a file all ready to cut. I've adjusted everything I need to it. I've double checked it. So let's go ahead now and get this set up on the CNC machine and start cutting our first bar stool seat. Super happy with this. I think it came out really well thanks to the sample that we cut. We still have these little ridges in here, but I don't think it takes away from the seat very much. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pop it out, cut it out of the material block, and then we're gonna sand down the edges, and maybe we'll talk a little bit more about it in a second. So yeah, like I mentioned, that turned out really good. You can see that thanks to this test sample, everything looks like it should be. This is a lighter oak, I think. That's why you can't see the lines as much, but I'm really happy with that. This is great for a really simple project you can do in VCarve. It gets you off to the right foot, or off on the right foot, excuse me. You could do some sanding on this and make it nice and smooth, which would be great. But I think I like to try this again in Aspire and actually model a proper 3D top for this. And I've got some neat techniques that I want to show you on how to do that. So let's go ahead and put these aside, and then we'll pop into Aspire and I'll get modeling a brand new seat top.
To get started, I'm going to open up that VCarve file into Aspire, and I'm going to copy the vectors that I need to start off this 3D modeled version onto a sheet that I've already created called 3D modeling sheet. So I'll just select those vectors, I'll right click on them and say copy to this new sheet that I created. Then what I'll do is I'll make that sheet active, and I'm going to grab the larger oval and I'm going to right click on that and delete out 3 of the spans. I only need the top left quadrant of that, so we'll delete those out of there. Now I can just hover over those and press D on my keyboard if I wanted to, but in this case I right clicked and chose delete span from the drop down menu. Now we're going to go ahead and join those 2 vectors up, and we're going to do exactly the same for this center part. Delete the parts I don't need of that circle, and then go ahead and join it up with that remaining span. Now I need to create the cross section that I'm going to extrude between those two drive rails. Now this is where the power of Aspire comes in. I can make the shape anything I want it to be, where with VCarve I was stuck to just the fluting toolpath options that I had. Now that looks pretty good. It's going to be a negative shape because of course I'm removing it away from the top of this seat. Let's go ahead and select those two drive rails. Do a quick 2-rail sweep. I'm going to use that selection. I'm going to grab that cross section, but I make sure I don't have scale cross sections with width, and I want to make sure that I scale it to an exact height. That's 0.35 of an inch. And we can go ahead and add that to our job. And there we have it, exactly what I want. Now to make my life a little bit easier, I'm going to turn this level into a mirrored level using one of our level effects called mirror mode. So I'm going to mirror the left over the right, and that way I can just nudge over that left half on to the right side to make it look a little bit better and to close up that gap. Next thing I want to do is create a brand new level. And this level I'm actually going to create a 3-dimensional seat with a little bit of a rounded over edge. So I'm going to use the dome profile, an angle of 90 degrees. I'm going to limit my height to 0.35 of an inch, which is the same depth as that recess or that impression that I created. And when I add that in there, you'll see what happens. We get this nice looking seat. Now to get rid of everything that goes below the 0 plane, I'm going to add in a brand new level and then add in a 0 plane. But I want to make sure that I merge in that level. Top tip, merge in that level. Now because we've added in that 0 plane, we have these strange little dips at the bottom where our model actually dips below the modeling plane. So we can use one of our very special features of Aspire to get rid of this. But first of all, I need to give you some background on how all the different combine modes work in Aspire. In Aspire, we have 5 different combine modes that we can use to tell the software how we would like components, groups of components, or levels to interact with each other. First of all, we have add. Then we have subtract. We have merge high, merge low, and then we have multiply. As a quick example, let's have a look at this series of cubes and domes that I've created. Each dome has been set to a different combine mode. This first one has been set to add, so what I can do is drag it on top of this cube, and you'll see that it adds itself to that cube. This dome has been set to subtract, so when I drag it on top of this cube, you'll see that it subtracts itself away from that cube. This one I've set to be merge high, so if I double click on that and drag it over top of this cube, you'll see it merges itself into that cube. This one is set to merge low, so when I drag it into that cube component, you'll see what happens. The result is only the lowest set of pixel heights. And this last one, it's been set to add, but I wanted to point out that before we do anything with that the shape height of this is set to 1. If I go ahead and right click on this and change the combine mode to be multiply, you'll see that it disappears. What the software is doing is it's multiplying the pixels underneath the dome by the pixel heights of the dome itself. So in this case, there is no pixels underneath the dome, so everything is 0. If I drag it on top of the cube, you'll see what happens. The pixels in the middle have been multiplied by 1 of the cube, so they're at the height they should be at. And then as we go down to the edge of the dome, those pixels taper off to be 0. Now, one of the neat tricks about this, if I go ahead and scale up this dome so that it covers up the whole entire cube, and then I go back and change its shape height back to 1, then you'll see what's happened. We've actually used that dome to visually bend that cube down to almost the modeling plane. That's a really powerful tool that we can use in all kinds of different situations. Let's go ahead and use that multiply combine mode to fix our seat. So let's copy component number 2 down to level number 1. That's our seat component. Let's hide the other levels. Now let's right click on component number 2 and change that to a multiply component. You'll see what happens. Now let's not forget to go ahead and change the shape height of that to be 1. And that way all of our multiplication will happen properly. And let's close that down. And you'll see now what happens is we actually round over the front of that seat. It's a bit hard to see here, but once we add in these other components, you'll see that that dip is now missing out of the front of our seat, and everything is now nice and straight. I really should just take a few minutes and play around with a multiply component. If you still have any questions about that, we have a great video tutorial called Creating a Dished Recess, where we put a horse's head inside of a dished recess using the multiply component. It's a great one to watch and might help to clear up any confusion that you might have. Now let's get on to some tooling. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is just make sure our material setup is okay. So we're going to push that model that we created all the way to the top of our material. And then we're going to check all the rest of our settings and click OK. Let's go ahead and retile our view. And let's start off with a 3D roughing toolpath. So we're going to select that outside vector. We're going to use a 1/4 inch end mill for this. That selected vector again. We're going to make sure we have a boundary offset of a 1/2 inch. I know that may seem like a lot, but that'll ensure I get rid of all the material I need to. We're going to go ahead and add a machining allowance, and we're just going to go ahead and calculate that. As always, we should preview our toolpaths to make sure they look like what we expect them to be. And if so, we can move on to the next one. Let's do our 3D finishing pass. We're going to use that bowl bit, that selected vector, bit of a boundary offset for us, raster toolpath strategy, and then we can go ahead and calculate that. Now again, one of the great things about version 11.5 of your software is that when we preview our toolpaths, we can take a look around it, so we can twiddle it while it's actually showing us where the tool is, and we can check out any problems that we might have. One of the problems that I see here is that as that seat recess or impression kind of rounds up to the edge of my seat, there's quite a heavy, sharp line. I think what I would do in the end is go back in and adjust that profile vector that I did the 2-rail sweep with, make it a little more rounder on the top. And I think I'll do that with the file that I'm going to give you. And that looks really nice in the end. There's that spot right there I'm going to fix. And we can go ahead now and jump right into our cutout pass. Very, very basic. We're going to make sure we cut down the Z thickness of our material. We might want to start a little bit deeper because some of that material is going to be removed, but that's all right. We'll add in some 3D tabs here, and we're just going to check for the placement of those. That's perfect. We'll go ahead and rename that and then calculate that. And again, as always, if we're happy with that preview of the toolpath, we can go ahead and save off our toolpaths and get cutting.
So there we have it. I showed you the multiply technique in the software, and also that we're going to use this same bowl bit for the finishing bit on this this new seat, which I think is going to work out really, really well in the end. It'll cut really fast too, which is a nice upside of a big bit like this. Now I've already gone ahead and cut a piece of material and measured it up. It does have a big old knot in it right there. I'm not going to try to avoid that. It's going to hit wherever it hits. Let's just hope it adds a nice rustic feel to it. So let's go get this on the CNC machine and get the cut started. This was really good because we can see that our roughing pass nearly wiped out that knot that's there, so maybe there won't be much left of that. But you know, I'm kind of sad about that because it might take away a little bit of the rustic feel. But now we're going to swap in the bowl bit and do the finishing pass. That cut pretty good. The board wasn't entirely flat, so there are some flat spots on the top, but I don't think that's a bad thing. It's supposed to look a little rustic. If I was gonna do it again, I might actually skim the top of the board first, but overall I'm pretty happy. So let's just change the bit and run the cutout pass. Yeah, that looks really good. There's a bit of the knot left. I really like that a lot. So we're gonna pop this off, cut it out of the block of material, do a little sanding, and then we'll start to assemble. Obviously, it's not much of a stool without legs, so I've already pre-cut some legs. Not to worry, the sheets are in the files that you're going to get with this project, so you can cut your own legs, and a back plate also that we're going to attach to the bottom of this particular seat so that I have locations to glue the legs into. I'm not going to go over how I made those. It's pretty easy stuff, a few profile cuts and some pockets, and everything's said and done, and you can figure that out in the file. So right now what I'm going to do is I'm run back over to the CNC machine, cut out the plate, do a little glue up and assembly, and this will be almost ready to go. Okay, so I got that all clamped up. We're gonna let that dry, do a little sanding around the edges, then glue in the legs. And that should be it. So there we go, all glued up and sanded down. It looks pretty good. There's a bit of a gap there. I think it's because the wood was bowed a bit, but I think it's all right. Looks really good to me, I think. Give it that rustic feel. Now what we're gonna do is go ahead and flip it over, and then we're gonna fit the legs in and glue them in place, which they should fit in there really quite nicely. So we're gonna go ahead and just glue those in there, and then we'll be ready to apply a finish if we feel like it. So there you have it. So as I showed you, you can make a nice stool seat using the fluting toolpath in VCarve Pro, which works really well. It has some limitations, or you can go full out and you can make a really bespoke one using Aspire and do your own 3D model. I really like this a lot. And then it all started out with me just trying to figure out how to use this new bit that I have. Well, if you enjoyed that video, could you please give it a thumbs up? If you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, please do. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. Until next time, have fun.